Maren had spent 3 years smelling like grease and dish soap so that Cyprian could smell like success. When he was a disgraced exile, she worked double shifts at a shipyard to pay for the legal fees that restored his name. She loved him when he was just a man in a rain-soaked coat, sharing a single cup of coffee in a drafty apartment. But the moment the crown was back on his head and the Thorne group was restored to its former glory, Cyprian decided that Maren was a smudge on his pristine new life. At his restoration gala, surrounded by the flash of cameras and the scent of expensive lilies, he leaned in and whispered the words that ended her world. "You were a wonderful bridge, Maren. But I've reached the other side now." He walked away to greet a duchess, leaving Maren standing in a thrift store dress. He thought he was discarding a waitress. He didn't realize he was insulting the secret heir to the Linden-Voss fortune, the very empire currently deciding whether to save his company or crush it into the dirt. Maren watched him go, the warmth in her eyes cooling into a terrifying, crystalline resolve. She had loved the man, but she would destroy the king. The ballroom of the Grand Azure was a cathedral of glass and gold, illuminated by 1,000 flickering candles that smelled of expensive beeswax and cold ambition. Cyprian stood at the center of the whirlpool, the black silk of his tuxedo fitting him like armor. He looked every bit the restored prince of industry. 6 months ago, he had been a pariah. Tonight, the men who had spit on him were lining up to kiss his signet ring. Maren stood a few feet away, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her dress. It was a simple, tea-length navy gown she'd found in a consignment shop and spent 3 nights tailoring by hand. To her, it felt like a victory. To the room, it was a neon sign of her low status. She watched Cyprian laugh, a rich, confident sound she used to love, and waited for him to catch her eye. She wanted to share a look, a secret, we made it smile. Instead, Cyprian turned his back on her to greet the Belgian ambassador. "You look like you're waiting for a bus in a room full of private jets," a voice drawled. Maren turned to see Julianna, a woman whose family name was synonymous with steel and old, cruel money. Julianna's diamonds were worth more than the shipyard Maren had worked in for 3 years. "I'm waiting for my partner," Maren said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Oh, darling," Julianna smirked, eyes raking over Maren's thrift store lace. "Cyprian doesn't have partners. He has tools. And looking at the way he's watching the Lady of Norfolk, I'd say your utility has expired." Maren felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She moved through the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs, until she reached Cyprian. She touched his arm, the arm she had bandaged when he'd been too drunk and defeated to care for himself. He didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge the touch. He waited until the ambassador moved away before finally looking down at her. His eyes, once warm with the shared intimacy of their struggle, were now as flat and gray as slate. "Maren," he said, his voice dropping into a low, professional register. "We need to speak. Privately." He led her into the darkened alcove behind the grand staircase, where the music of the string quartet became a muffled, distant hum. "The restoration is complete," Cyprian began, refusing to look her in the eye. "The Thorne group is solvent. My seat on the board is secure. But with that security comes a set of expectations." "Expectations?" Maren whispered. "The board needs a certain image, Maren. They need a merger, not just of companies, but of bloodlines. Julianna's father is offering a partnership that would make the Thorne group untouchable." He finally looked at her, his expression one of mild inconvenience. "You were wonderful, Maren. You were the bridge that got me across the abyss. But I've reached the other side now. And bridges aren't meant to be lived on." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. For a heartbeat, she thought he was joking that this was a proposal. But when he opened it, it wasn't a ring. It was a key to a luxury apartment in the city's quietest district. "It's paid for. 5 years. A generous stipend has been set up in your name. You won't have to work at the docks ever again." Maren looked at the key, then at the man she had sacrificed her youth, her savings, and her pride for. She realized then that she hadn't been loving a man, she had been life-supporting a monster. A bridge, she repeated, her voice losing its softness, turning into something cold and metallic. It's for the best, Cyprian said, already checking his watch. I have to give the toast. Please, slip out the back. It would be awkward if the press saw you leaving in tears. He walked away, stepping back into the light of the gala without a single backward glance. Maren stood in the shadows, the velvet box heavy in her hand. She didn't cry. The tears she'd saved for him had dried up the moment his ego eclipsed his soul. She reached into her navy dress, not for a handkerchief, but for the encrypted burner phone she had kept hidden for 3 years. She dialed a number she hadn't touched since the day she'd run away from her father's suffocating palace. It's Maren, she said when the line connected. The experiment is over. Send the car. And tell the Linden-Voss board to prepare for a hostile takeover of the Thorne group. I want it leveled by morning. The morning after the gala, Cyprian felt like a god. He stood in the Thorne group's glass-walled boardroom, 60 floors above the city, watching the fog roll off the river. He had slept 4 hours and woken up with the taste of victory in his mouth. Beside him, Julianna's father, Arthur, was already reviewing the merger documents. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the alliance that would cement the Thorne name for another century. The Linden-Voss group has been quiet lately, Arthur remarked, tapping his gold pen against the mahogany table. If we close this deal by noon, we'll have enough market share to freeze them out of the Western Corridor entirely. They're the only ones left who could challenge us. Cyprian adjusted his tie in the reflection of the window. Linden-Voss is a relic. They haven't had a visible leader in 5 years. It's a headless giant, Arthur. We have nothing to fear from them. The door to the boardroom burst open. It wasn't the legal team or the caterers. It was Cyprian's chief financial officer, a man whose face was currently the color of unbaked dough. Sir, the CFO stammered, his iPad trembling in his hand. We have a problem. A massive problem. Cyprian didn't turn around. I'm in the middle of a merger, Elias. Whatever it is, handle it. I can't handle it, sir. Our credit lines, they've been pulled. All of them. Simultaneously. Cyprian turned then, his eyes narrowing. That's impossible. We just secured the restructuring loans from the National Bank. The National Bank just sold our debt, Elias said, his voice rising in panic. At 6 a.m. this morning, a private equity firm bought 90% of our outstanding liabilities. They've invoked the insecurity clause. They're demanding full repayment of $400 million. Within the hour. Arthur stood up, his face hardening. The insecurity clause? No one uses that unless they're trying to trigger a bankruptcy. Who bought the debt, Elias? Elias tapped his screen, his fingers fumbling. A subsidiary of Linden-Voss. A firm called the Bridge Holdings. The word hit Cyprian like a physical blow. Bridge. He felt a sudden, sharp memory of the velvet box in the alcove, of Maren's quiet voice repeating the word back to him. Bridges aren't meant to be lived on. It's a coincidence, Cyprian hissed, though his heart began to drum a frantic rhythm. It's just a name. Linden-Voss is just predatory. They saw a vulnerability and they're pouncing. There's more, Elias whispered. Our main supplier in the shipyard, the ones who provide the specialized steel? They just canceled our contracts. They cited a moral conflict with the current leadership of the Thorne Group. Moral conflict? Arthur barked. We're in business, not a church. Cyprian, what the hell is going on? My daughter's reputation is tied to this merger. If you're being targeted, I need to know why. Cyprian grabbed the iPad from Elias's hands. He scrolled through the filings, his eyes skipping over the legal jargon until he reached the signature line of the new ownership. It wasn't a name. It was a digital seal, a crest of a linden tree entwined with a silver fox. Underneath the seal was a short, typed memo meant only for the eyes of the board. A bridge is a dangerous place to stand when the architect decides to pull the supports. You forgot that the girl who held the tools knows exactly where the bolts are loose. Cyprian felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to tilt. The headless giant of Linden-Voss wasn't headless at all. It had been sitting in his kitchen for 3 years, eating cheap noodles and listening to him brag about his genius. Cyprian. Arthur's voice was like a whip. Who is the architect? Cyprian looked out the window at the city. Somewhere out there, the girl who smelled like grease and dish soap was gone. In her place was a queen who had just moved her first pawn. The woman I just threw away, Cyprian whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his empire beginning to crack. The lobby of the Linden-Voss headquarters was a fortress of brushed steel and silence. For years, the public had speculated about the heir, the mysterious successor who had supposedly been traveling the world to study global markets. In reality, the heir had been in a shipyard in the rain, learning how a man's character dissolves when he thinks no one is looking. Maren stood in the private elevator, watching the floor numbers climb. The Navy thrift store dress was gone, shredded and tossed into a furnace at dawn. In its place, she wore a bespoke suit of charcoal wool, the lines so sharp they looked dangerous. A pair of heirloom pearl earrings, the only things she'd taken from her mother's vault years ago, glowed against her skin like small, cold moons. The presses gathered in the atrium. Ms. Voss, her chief of staff, a woman named Holloway who had been waiting for this day for 3 years, whispered. The Thorne group has sent 3 separate legal envoys. Cyprian himself is at the gate. He's demanding to speak with the chairman. Maren adjusted her cuffs, her movements precise and devoid of the nervous fidgeting that had characterized her life with Cyprian. Let him wait. He's spent the morning looking for a man in a suit. Let him find a woman in one instead. The elevator doors opened directly onto a raised dais overlooking the atrium. 100 cameras flashed simultaneously, a wall of white light that would have blinded the old Maren. The new Maren didn't even blink. She walked to the podium, the clicking of her heels echoing through the sudden, stunned silence of the room. In the front row, held back by a velvet rope and a phalanx of security, stood Cyprian. He looked as though he had aged a decade in a single night. His tie was slightly askew, and his eyes were wild with a mixture of terror and dawning recognition. When Maren reached the microphone, his jaw didn't just drop, he stepped forward, a strangled sound escaping his throat. Maren, he gasped, the name catching in the quiet room. She didn't look at him. She looked at the cameras. For the past century, Linden-Voss has been a pillar of stability, Maren began, her voice projected with a calm, melodic authority that vibrated through the hall. But stability without integrity is just a slow rot. Today, we are announcing a total restructuring of our domestic holdings. We have acquired the debt of the Thorne Group, not as an investment, but as an audit. We intend to hold their leadership accountable for every lie, every tax evasion, and every human cost they've incurred on their climb back to the top. A reporter shouted over the din, Ms. Voss. Why no? And what is your connection to Cyprian Thorne? Maren finally shifted her gaze. She looked down at Cyprian, who was staring up at her as if she were a ghost. The man who had told her she was a wonderful bridge looked like he was drowning on dry land. Mr. Thorne and I have a history, Maren said, the corner of her mouth twitching into a smile that never reached her eyes. I spent 3 years observing his genius from the front lines. I saw how he treats those he deems beneath him. And as the new chair of Linden-Voss, I've decided that a man who cannot value a partner cannot be trusted with a market. Cyprian lunged for the rope. Maren, listen to me. You can't do this. We were everything. We were an experiment, Cyprian, she said, her voice amplified so that every journalist in the room could hear it. I wanted to see if you loved the woman who gave you everything or the power she could provide. You chose the power. It's only fair that I take it back. She turned from the podium, leaving the room in a state of absolute chaos. Behind her, she heard Cyprian's voice being muffled by security, the sound of a king realize he had just been checkmated by the person who had been his only sanctuary. Cyprian stood in the center of his ancestral study, the room where 4 generations of Thorne men had smoked cigars and signed the deeds to the city. Usually, the scent of old leather and expensive scotch gave him a sense of immortality. Today, it smelled like a tomb. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a moving crew's boots in the hallway. "You can't be serious," Cyprian said, his voice echoing hollowly off the vaulted ceiling. A man in a sharp, nondescript suit stood by the door, holding a clipboard. He didn't look like a thug, he looked like a bureaucrat, which was infinitely more terrifying. The property was put up as collateral for the 2023 restructuring loan, Mr. Thorne. Since the Bridge Holdings, a subsidiary of Linden-Voss, purchased that debt and called it due this morning, the deed has reverted to the creditor. You have 2 hours to remove personal effects. Furniture and fixtures are considered part of the estate. Cyprian lunged for his phone, dialing his lawyers for the 50th time. The call went straight to a recorded message. He tried Arthur, his would-be father-in-law. The man who had been so eager to merge bloodlines at the Gala didn't even pick up. In the high society circles of the elite, failure was a communicable disease, and Cyprian was currently patient 0. He stormed out of the study and down the grand staircase, nearly colliding with a mover carrying a crate of his vintage wine. At the bottom of the stairs, standing in the marble foyer where they had once shared a pizza on the floor when he was broke and dreaming of this very house, was Maren. She looked different in the daylight of his home. She wasn't the waitress in the shipyard, nor was she the untouchable queen on the dais. She was a silent storm. She was wearing a trench coat, her hands deep in her pockets, as she surveyed the portraits of his ancestors on the walls. "Maren," he gasped, his anger momentarily replaced by a desperate, pathetic hope. "Maren, this is too much. This house, it's been in my family for 100 years. You know what it means to me. You were here when I got the keys back. You cried with me." Maren turned to look at him. Her eyes weren't filled with the rage he expected. They were filled with a profound, clinical curiosity. "I did cry, Cyprian. I cried because I thought I was seeing a man reclaim his legacy. I didn't realize I was watching a monster reclaim his cage." She walked over to a portrait of his grandfather. "He was a hard man, from what you told me. But he never turned his back on the people who built his empire. You, on the other hand, treat loyalty like a currency to be spent and discarded." "I made a mistake," Cyprian shouted, the sound bouncing off the cold marble. "The Gala, it was the pressure. The board, Arthur, the image, I thought I had to do it for us. To secure our future. There was no us, Cyprian. There was only you and the person you used as a footstool," Maren said quietly. She stepped closer, her scent no longer grease, but something expensive and floral, filling his senses. "I'm not taking this house because I want to live in it. I'm taking it because you don't deserve a sanctuary. You told me bridges aren't meant to be lived on. Well, palaces aren't meant to be built on lies." She nodded to the man with the clipboard. "The portraits go to the Historical Society. The wine goes to the Shipyard Workers' Union for their annual gala. And the house." She looked back at Cyprian, a cold, sharp smile touching her lips. "I've already signed the papers to turn it into a shelter for displaced dock workers. They'll sleep in your bedroom, Cyprian. They'll eat in your dining room. And they'll never have to smell your arrogance again." Cyprian watched as a mover took the keys from the sideboard, the gold keys he had polished every morning. He felt the world shrinking until there was nothing left but the space he stood in. "Where am I supposed to go?" he whispered. Maren paused at the front door, the sunlight framing her like a vengeful deity. "You still have the key to that apartment I gave you last night, don't you? It's the only asset I haven't seized. I suggest you go there. It's a very sturdy bridge, Cyprian. I'd be careful not to burn it." As she walked out, the heavy oak doors groaned shut, the click of the lock sounding like a gavel. The atmosphere inside Christie's auction house was thick with the scent of old money and predatory anticipation. For Cyprian, this was a funeral disguised as an event. Under the flickering glow of the crystal chandeliers, he sat in the back row, his coat collar turned up, hoping the shadows would swallow him. On the block today was his final tether to the life he had known, a 1958 Ferrari 250 GT and a collection of rare, first edition manuscripts his father had spent 30 years accumulating. He needed the liquid capital. His personal bank accounts were still frozen under the fraudulent transfer flags Maren's lawyers had raised, and the luxury apartment she'd given him was becoming a gilded cage. He had exactly $300 in his pocket and a stomach tied in knots. Lot 402, the auctioneer droned, his voice sharp and rhythmic. The Thorne collection. We'll begin with the 1958 Ferrari. Bidding starts at $2 million. Cyprian leaned forward, his heart hammering. If this sold for $5, he could hire a new legal team. He could fight back. He could find a way to prove Maren had overreached. $2 million, the auctioneer noted, pointing to a bidder in the front. 2.5. $3 million. The room hummed. This was the car Cyprian had promised to take Maren to the coast in once the Thorne group was restored. He remembered her laughing as she looked at the brochure, telling him she'd settle for a picnic in the park as long as he was driving. For $1 million to the gentleman in the blue, the auctioneer said. Suddenly, a paddle went up in the private booth overlooking the floor, a glass-fronted sanctuary for the ultra-elite who didn't wish to be seen. $10 million, a cool, feminine voice announced over the speaker system. The room went silent. The jump was unheard of, a move designed to kill the competition instantly. Cyprian stood up, his eyes fixed on the darkened glass of the booth. He knew that voice. It was the voice that had whispered to him in the dark when he was at his lowest, and the voice that had dismantled him in the light. $10 million going once, twice, sold to the Linden-Voss envoy. The gavel cracked. The pattern continued for the next hour. Every piece of his history, every object of beauty he had ever owned, was snapped up by the same invisible bidder. Maren wasn't just buying his things, she was collecting his life, piece by piece, as if she were gathering evidence of a crime. As the crowd dispersed, Cyprian intercepted the Linden-Voss representative in the lobby. He was a tall, silver-haired man who looked at Cyprian with the same warmth one might give a stray dog. "Tell her I want to talk," Cyprian hissed. "Tell her this is enough. She's made her point." "The chair is currently occupied, Mr. Thorne," the man said, stepping aside as a private door opened. Maren stepped out. She wasn't in a suit today. She wore a simple, elegant black wrap dress and a single strand of pearls. She looked like a woman who was at peace, while Cyprian looked like a man who had been caught in a storm. "The Ferrari, Maren? Really?" Cyprian stepped into her path, his voice low and desperate. "You don't even like to drive. You used to fall asleep in the passenger seat." "I didn't buy it for the engine," Cyprian, Maren said, her gaze steady. "I bought it because I remember the day you told me that car was worth more than the lives of 1,000 dockworkers. I thought it would be poetic to have it crushed and sold for scrap. The proceeds will fund a scholarship for the children of the men you laid off last month." Cyprian recoiled as if she'd struck him. "You're destroying history." "My history." "I'm clearing the slate," she corrected him. She stepped closer and for a moment, the mask slipped. He saw a flash of the girl he had known, the one who had loved him, but it was buried under layers of cold, hard diamond. "You love these things more than you love the person who helped you get them. Now you have neither. How does it feel to be the only thing in this room that no one wants to bid on?" She walked past him, her security detail forming a wall of muscle and wool. Cyprian stood alone in the center of the lobby, surrounded by the ghosts of his possessions, realizing that Maren hadn't just taken his wealth, she had taken his value. Cyprian sat on the floor of his sparsely furnished apartment, a bottle of cheap rye, the only thing he could afford, clutched in his hand. The moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting long, cage-like shadows across the linoleum. As the alcohol burned his throat, His mind drifted back to the night the rot had truly set in. It was 4 months before the gala. They were in their cramped, 4th floor walk-up, the air thick with the smell of Maren's homemade stew and the dampness of the shipyard. Cyprian had just received the first whisper of a lead, a former associate willing to flip on the board members who had framed him. He had been ecstatic, pacing the small kitchen while Maren sat at the table, her hands red and raw from a double shift. "This is it, Maren," he had said, his eyes wild with the first taste of reclaimed power. "One more move and the Thorne group is mine again. We'll be untouchable." Maren had looked up, a tired but beautiful smile on her face. "Not untouchable, Cyprian. Just home. We can finally stop running." He remembered looking at her then, and for the first time, a dark, cold thought had taken root. He saw the flower on her cheek and the fraying hem of her sweater, and he didn't see a partner. He saw a reminder of his failure. She was the witness to his lowest moments, the man who cried in his sleep, the man who couldn't pay the heating bill, the man who was weak. To be the king he wanted to be, he felt he had to erase the man who had needed her. The memory shifted to a week later. He had been meeting secretly with Arthur, the steel magnate. They were in a private club, the kind of place where the carpet muffled the sound of conscience. "You have the drive," Thorne, Arthur had said, swirling a glass of 30-year-old scotch. "But the public needs a narrative. They need to see a man who never fell, only paused. And frankly, this girl you're with, she's a liability. She looks like a waitress. She smells like the docks. You can't bring a dock worker to a coronation." Cyprian had opened his mouth to defend her. He had thought of the nights she had stayed up to proofread his legal filings. He had thought of her selling her grandmother's locket to buy him a suit for his first interview. But the words died in his throat, choked by the sudden, soaring heat of his own ambition. "She's just a temporary arrangement," Cyprian had lied, the words feeling like a betrayal of his own soul. "A vestige of my time in the wilderness. I know what the image requires, Arthur." As he sat in the dark apartment now, that lie echoed in his ears until it sounded like a scream. He realized that Maren hadn't changed. He had. She had stayed the same steady, brilliant, and loyal woman. He was the one who had traded a diamond for a piece of glass because the glass looked better under the ballroom lights. He leaned his head against the wall, a sob finally breaking through his chest. He remembered a morning when they were at their poorest, sharing a single piece of toast. Maren had kissed his forehead and told him, "I don't care if we ever get the Thorne group back, Cyprian. I just want you." He had been loved by a queen, and he had treated her like a bridge. He hadn't just lost his company or his house. He had lost the only person in the world who knew the man behind the suit and loved him anyway. The rye tasted like ash. He was finally the king of his own empty room, and the silence was his only subject. Cyprian waited for 4 hours in the lobby of the Linden-Voss tower. He no longer looked like a titan. He looked like a man who had been caught in a landslide. His suit was a season old, his chin was shadowed by stubble, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. When Holloway finally descended the elevator to collect him, she didn't offer a greeting. She simply signaled for him to follow. They didn't go to the executive suite. Instead, she led him to the Rooftop conservatory, a glass-enclosed garden that felt like a sanctuary floating above the smog of the city. Maren was there, pruning a white orchid. She didn't look up when he approached. "I didn't come here to ask for the money back," Cyprian started, his voice cracking. "Or the house. Or the cars." Maren nipped a dead leaf from the stem. "Then why are you here, Cyprian?" "I'm quite busy. We're finalizing the acquisition of your former shipping partner this afternoon." "I came to say I'm sorry," he whispered. He took a step forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I've spent every night replaying that gala in my head. I've spent every night thinking about the apartment and the shipyard. I was blind, Maren. I let the noise and the ego drown out the only thing that actually mattered. You were my home, and I burned it down to build a monument to myself." Maren finally set the shears down. She turned to face him, but she didn't look angry. She didn't look vengeful. She looked at him with a soft, devastating pity that was harder to bear than a slap. "I forgive you, Cyprian," she said quietly. He felt a surge of hope so sharp it nearly knocked him over. "You do? Then, can we talk? Can we try to find a way back to what we were?" "You didn't listen," Maren said, her voice as calm as a frozen pond. "I said I forgive you. But forgiveness isn't a reset button. It's just the act of letting go of the weight. I've let go of the anger. I've let go of the betrayal. And in doing so, I've let go of you." She walked toward the edge of the glass wall, looking out at the sprawling horizon. "You think this is about revenge, but it's not. Revenge requires passion. It requires me to wake up thinking about you. But the truth is, Cyprian, I haven't thought about you at all today. I've been thinking about the new clean water initiative in the harbor. I've been thinking about the board meeting. You've become a footnote in a life that is finally mine." "Maren, please," he begged, reaching out for her hand, but she stepped back, not out of fear, but out of a simple desire not to be touched. "The man I loved was a man who didn't exist," she said. "I loved a version of you that I helped create. I loved your potential for goodness. But you showed me your reality, and I have to respect that. You chose the king, Cyprian. And the king is a very lonely title." She picked up her tablet from a stone bench. "I've instructed my lawyers to release your personal trust. You won't be wealthy, but you'll be comfortable. You can go anywhere, do anything. But you can't be here." "I don't want the money," he shouted, the sound echoing off the glass. "I want you." Maren looked at him one last time, and for a fleeting second, he saw the girl from the shipyard. Then, the veil of the queen dropped back into place. "You had me, Cyprian. You had me when I was a waitress, and you had me when I was a queen. You just didn't know how to keep either. Goodbye." As she walked toward the elevator, she didn't look back. Cyprian stood alone in the garden, surrounded by beautiful things he could no longer own, realizing that the cold reality wasn't that she hated him. It was that he no longer mattered. Cyprian sought refuge in the one place he thought he still had a shred of leverage, the Somerset Club. It was a place of dark mahogany and hushed whispers, where Julianna and her father, Arthur, spent their afternoons. He bypassed the concierge, his frantic energy pushing him through the heavy doors into the lounge. He needed an ally, a bridge back to the world of the living, and Julianna, his fiancée, was the only card he had left to play. He found them in a corner booth, bathed in the soft amber glow of a Tiffany lamp. They weren't mourning the collapse of the Thorne-Arthur merger. In fact, they were laughing. Julianna looked radiant, a new emerald sparkling on her throat that hadn't been there 2 nights ago. "Julianna," Cyprian gasped, stumbling toward the table. "Arthur. Thank God. My accounts are being released, but I need a seat at the table. If we can pool our remaining resources, we can find a loophole in the Linden-Voss acquisition." The laughter stopped. It didn't stop abruptly, like a record skipping. It faded out like a joke that had finally reached its punchline. Julianna set her champagne flute down with a delicate clink. She looked at Cyprian as if he were a waiter who had spilled soup on her lap, an annoyance to be handled, not a person to be acknowledged. "Cyprian," she said, her voice a polished blade. "What on earth are you doing here? This is a private lounge." "I'm your fiancé," he stammered, his eyes starting between them. "Arthur, we had a deal." "A bloodline merger, you said." Arthur leaned back, clipping the end of a cigar with clinical precision. "A bloodline merger requires blood that actually carries value, Thorne. At the Gala, you were the rising sun. Today, you're a solar flare that's already burned out. You're radioactive. No one in this room will even look at you, let alone partner with you." "But Julianna." "Julianna is engaged," Arthur interrupted, lighting his cigar. "To the CEO of the Maritime Union. The merger is already back on track, just with a more stable foundation." Julianna smiled, and for the first time, Cyprian saw her clearly. She didn't have Maren's depth or her quiet brilliance. She was a predator, just like him. She had never loved him. She had loved the crown he had promised her. Now that the crown was in Maren's vault, Julianna had simply shopped for a new one. "You were a charming distraction, Cyprian," Julianna said, leaning forward. "But let's be honest, you were always a bit of a social climber, weren't you? Using that poor little shipyard girl to fund your way back to the top?" It was quite scandalous once the Linden-Voss PR team leaked the details. "My father can't be associated with that kind of middle-class messiness." Cyprian felt a wave of nausea. He had thrown away a woman who would have died for him for a woman who wouldn't even buy him a drink. He had traded gold for a handful of glitter, and the glitter was currently laughing at him. "You're just like me," Cyprian whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and realization. "No, darling," Julianna purred, waving a hand for security. "I'm a survivor. You're just a casualty. Now, do be a dear and leave quietly. You're ruining the atmosphere." As two burly men in suits stepped forward to escort him out, Cyprian realized the ultimate irony. Maren had taken his empire out of a sense of justice, but Julianna had abandoned him out of a sense of convenience. One had loved him too much, and the other hadn't loved him at all. He was cast out into the cold street, a man who had finally run out of bridges to cross. The final board meeting of the Thorne group did not take place in a skyscraper. It took place in a sterile, windowless conference room in the basement of the federal courthouse. The air smelled of ozone and old paper. Cyprian sat at the head of a table that no longer belonged to him, surrounded by directors who refused to meet his eye. They were looking at their tablets, watching the live ticker of their own extinction. Maren entered the room exactly 1 minute before the session began. She didn't bring a swarm of lawyers or a phalanx of security. She brought a single leather folder and a silence that felt heavier than the building above them. She sat at the opposite end of the long table, the physical distance between her and Cyprian representing the light years of difference in their current standing. "This is a hostile takeover," one of the board members croaked, his voice thin with terror. "You've strangled our supply lines, bought our debt, and liquidated our subsidiaries. This isn't business, Ms. Voss. This is an execution." Maren didn't look at the speaker. She looked at Cyprian. "It's a foreclosure," she corrected. "The Thorne Group has been operating on a deficit of ethics for years. You've traded on a reputation you didn't earn and built on a foundation of unpaid debts, both financial and human." She opened the folder. As of 9 a.m., Linden-Voss has acquired the remaining 14% of voting shares held by the Arthur Group. We now hold a supermajority. My first motion as the primary shareholder is the total dissolution of the Thorne Group. Dissolution. Cyprian's voice was a ragged shadow of itself. "You can't dissolve it. It's a century-old institution. My great-grandfather built it on the backs of people he eventually forgot," Maren finished. "The name Thorne will be stripped from every building, every letterhead, and every hull. The assets will be absorbed into the Linden-Voss Public Trust. The headquarters will be sold to the city for a nominal fee of $1 to be used as a public library and vocational center." Cyprian leaned over the table, his knuckles white. "You're erasing me. You're not just taking the money. You're erasing the fact that I ever existed." "I'm erasing the lie," Cyprian, Maren said. She stood up and began to walk the length of the table. As she passed each board member, they instinctively pulled their chairs back, as if she were a flame they feared to touch. She stopped behind Cyprian, leaning down so her voice was a private murmur against his ear. "You told me that you reached the other side of the bridge. But look around, Cyprian. There is no other side. There is just the water, and you are finally in it." She straightened up and addressed the room. "The vote is a formality. The signatures are already verified. You are all dismissed with your minimum severance packages. Mr. Thorne, however, has a different exit." She slid a final document in front of him. It was a release form. In exchange for his silence and his total departure from the industry, the Linden-Voss Trust would pay off his remaining personal debts, leaving him with exactly nothing, but also owing nothing. He would be a clean slate. A nobody. Cyprian looked at the pen. He looked at the woman who had once held his head while he cried, the woman he had deemed too common for his glory. She was the most powerful person in the room, not because of her money, but because she was the only one who didn't need anything from anyone in it. He signed. The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room. "It's done," Maren said. She took the paper, closed her folder, and walked out of the room. She didn't gloat. She didn't look back. She left him in a room full of men who were already standing up to leave, not even bothering to say goodbye to the man who was no longer their king. A year later, the city had a new skyline. The Thorne neon sign that had once dominated the north side of the river had been dismantled, replaced by a living green wall and a simple, illuminated crest of a linden tree. The street-level lobby was no longer a fortress of marble. It was a bustling public hub where students studied and dockworkers sat in the sun during their lunch breaks. Maren stood on the balcony of her private residence, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. She had just returned from a 3-month tour of the new Linden-Voss maritime schools. She was no longer the Iron Heir or the vengeful queen of the tabloids. She was simply a woman who had used a wrecking ball to clear a space for a garden. Her phone buzzed on the table, a private line. "The final audit is complete, Ms. Voss," Holloway's voice came through, sounding satisfied. "The last of the Thorne properties has been converted. The transition is absolute. Even the archives have been digitized and the physical records recycled. There isn't a single brick left with that name on it." "Thank you, Holloway," Maren said, her voice soft. "Close the file. I don't need any more updates on the past." She ended the call and looked down at the street below. She felt a profound sense of lightness. She had loved a man as a woman, with every scrap of her heart, and he had taught her that love without respect is just a hostage situation. She had lost him, yes, but she had gained a kingdom of her own making, one built on the transparency and grit he had lacked. Miles away, on the far edge of the harbor, a man sat on a wooden bench at the end of a weathered pier. Cyprian wore a heavy, salt-stained coat and a wool cap pulled low. He was no longer the king of industry. He was a night shift foreman at a small, independent shipping yard, the kind of place where men were judged by the strength of their knots rather than the cut of their suits. He lived in the small apartment Maren had given him, the one she had called a sturdy bridge. He had kept it clean, but it remained largely empty. Every morning, he walked to work past a statue in the park, a tribute to the laborers of the harbor, and every morning, he looked at the base where Maren's name was etched as the benefactor. He pulled a small, battered photo from his pocket. It wasn't a picture of the Thorne group or a Gala. It was a Polaroid Maren had taken of him years ago when they were living in the 4th floor walk-up. He was covered in grease, laughing at something she had said, looking truly happy. He realized now that he had been a king back then, too. He just hadn't been smart enough to realize his throne was the hand he was holding. He watched a Linden-Voss cargo ship pull into the harbor, its lights twinkling like fallen stars against the dark water. He didn't feel anger anymore. He didn't feel the urge to scheme or claw his way back. He just felt the cold, honest weight of the truth. Maren had flourished because she was real. He had withered because he was an ornament. He tucked the photo back into his pocket, stood up, and began his walk back to the apartment. The wind was sharp, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for a shortcut. He was just a man walking home in the dark. Maren turned away from the balcony and went inside, the glass door sliding shut with a silent, airtight seal. The man was a memory. The queen was a reality. And the bridge between them had finally, mercifully, collapsed into the sea. If you're currently wiping away tears after seeing Maren trade her grease-stained apron for a crown of ice, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to join our community for more stories about the high cost of betrayal and the power of a woman who finally knows her worth. Now, I have to know, which moment absolutely destroyed you? Was it hearing Cyprian tell Maren she was just a bridge after she gave him everything? Or was it that final, silent moment on the pier when he realized he'd traded a diamond for a handful of glitter? Drop a comment below and let's talk about that cold, hard justice. Thanks for being here to witness Maren's rise and Cyprian's wake-up call. Remember, people might treat you like a bridge today, but never forget, you are the architect of your own empire. See you on the next one.